expert in local government and federalism, Jaap de Visser, who is also director at the Dullah Omar Institute. Jaap, good morning. Thanks very much for your time. So we know that provinces in South Africa do enjoy at least some autonomy, but there's also been some tongue-in-cheek discussions around the Western Cape in particular being the Republic of the Western Cape within the Republic of South Africa.
Yeah, thanks. It's a fascinating question. I think the issue is a bit more complicated than that. I think there's a political way to analyze this, and I'm not a political scientist, but I do know that the DA is its highest political objective is not to create a seceded Western Cape or to separate the Western Cape from the country. That's not its highest political objective. Is to govern the entire country. It has national aspirations. So it's not a regional party that wants to secede from the country. And I think there's, of course, a little politicking happening. It's naturally a multi-level state. If there are different levels of government governed by different political parties, that there will be some tension between those levels. And of course, they're using the opportunity that I think also is sometimes handed to them on a platter by the national government to assert their autonomy. I think, for example, about the confusion about the opening of schools, where I think, there is a gazetted opening day of the 1st of June, which obviously was amended by a press statement Sunday evening. So that is then, an opportunity for the DA in the Western Cape to assert its autonomy and say, well, we're going to implement that 1st of June, thereby causing lots of confusion amongst parents.
Yeah. It's interesting because if we just look at the sort of historical issues around the Western Cape in particular, if we take it as far back as the CODESA discussions, there were discussions around certain parts of the country pushing for a federal state just because their support base at the time was so regionalized. And that's still true for the DA today in that its support base is also quite regionalized.
Yeah, I suppose if you want to trace the DA and its origins back to the Democratic Party and the National Party back in the day merged into the DA and what their positions were during CODESA, they had a much greater appetite for regionalism than the ANC. The ANC really didn't want federalism. In fact, it was called the F word, and nobody was allowed to use the F word. That's also why you don't hear our constitution being referred to as a federal constitution. It's not a very popular word. But if you look at what was the compromise that was struck during CODESA, was in fact a constitution that does give provinces certain powers guaranteed in the Constitution. And one of those powers, by the way, is primary education. It is a power of provinces to implement national laws when it comes to primary education. But it's a very weak form of federalism. It's a very integrated, centralized form of federalism because our provinces, for example, they do not levy any taxes, which makes them entirely dependent on the national government. So I think what was struck was a half-baked, centralized form of federalism where every now and then provinces, if they want to and if they have the political inclination, can use some of their powers to assert their autonomy. But in the end, it's the purse strings that matter, and I think that is in the end what counts the most.
It's very interesting that you talk about the fact that our constitution is not a federal constitution. We don't want to use that F word, as you say, but is it also true that, in fact, the Western Cape is the only province in the country that does have its own constitution? It's adopted a constitution of its own.
It has. It's the only one that has an adopted constitution. The KwaZulu-Natal also adopted a constitution, but it didn't pass the constitutional test. It was sent to the Constitutional Court for ratification or for certification, and the Constitutional Court sent it back, and that's sort of where it was left. So yes, it is the only province that has a constitution. To be fair, that doesn't really make a huge difference. It doesn't really set the Western Cape apart because there's very little space for provinces to do anything different from the national constitution. So that's not really where the big issue lies. I think it lies more in the Western Cape using its governance muscle, because obviously it's the DA true to its political aspirations, is using its governance power in the city of Cape Town and in the Western Cape as a springboard for national politics. And it has done so relatively effectively over the past few years. And I think that's where it uses our multi-level state or semi-federal state, whatever term you want to use, to assert some of its political aspirations.
So you've said to us, and you've clarified that you're not a political analyst. So when we think about things like, the DA deciding to make its own decision around the ban on the sale of cigarettes, for example, deciding to go with what has been gazetted and to send the province's children back to school on the 1st of June, you reckon this is more about politicking than anything else, really? I'm not so sure. I think really, if the one thing that this episode teaches us is that it is much easier to close down an economy than to open it up bit by bit. It is a complicated issue, and the whole of government is sent into a tailspin to make all kinds of very complicated decisions. So there's disagreement, and there's disagreement within sectors. There's disagreement across levels of government. So yes, it's a bit of politicking, but I think there's also real, genuine policy differences about these very complicated matters where nobody really knows exactly what's the right answer at any given point in time. And it's also, I suppose, good to remember that in the beginning of the lockdown, there was very good collaboration between all the provinces and the cities and the national government. There was unanimity almost when the decision was taken to lock down the economy. But opening it up is a bit more complicated and poses lots of complicated questions on which there will always be some disagreement. Yeah. There's always been this tit-for-tatting with decisions made by the governing party, the DA then taking it on review or challenging it somewhat. Essential to our democracy, as we know, but perhaps it leaves a different taste when you're dealing with issues like this in the midst of a pandemic and you're sending children to school when it's very clear that schools, in fact, are not ready and parents are still unsure, but you're insisting as the province with, I might add, the highest number of infections and deaths to send those children to school.
Yeah, I do think what we saw happening over the weekend was unseemly. It was really intergovernmental relations failing. Because I'm a parent myself. I have a grade 7 pupil in my household, and we were confused Sunday evening. And in the end, it was the lowest level of government, school governing body, that in the end told us, well, we're not going to open. It's too confusing. We can't do this to the parents and to the school community. And I think that is where intergovernmental relations fails, and fails as citizens, and causes confusion in a time where that is really not needed and unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,